This presentation is a cybersecurity risk assessment applicable to the Australian government's representative body in attendance at the 2019 Five Eyes Summit. The following content is intended to provide leadership with the recommendations of the cybersecurity team regarding the mitigation of potential information security risks that may exist during the summit event. This presentation has three sections. The first section, System Security, covers the existing security measures that are currently in place with specific emphasis on authentication, authorization, and access control. The second section, Vulnerability Assessment, identifies potential weaknesses in our organization's security. Each weakness or vulnerability is measured according to the likelihood and potential impact of its exploitation and assigned a severity score of high, medium, or low. The third and final section, Risk Mitigation, provides recommended mitigative actions that ought to be taken in response to these identified vulnerabilities. Authentication, authorization, and access control, or AAA, are the pillars of information security. Authentication within the context of system security is the process of proving your identity to a computer system. The most common way of providing authentication is to provide something you know, such as a username and password combination. A second method of authentication is to provide something you are, such as a fingerprint or a retinal scan. The third way of proving your identity would be to provide something you have, such as a digital certificate issued by a trusted entity that is installed on your smart card. These forms of authentication may be individually strengthened, such as with a strict password complexity requirement, or state-of-the-art retinal scanner, or dynamically rotating digital keys that prevent brute force attacks against encryption. However, requiring multiple forms of authentication to prove one's identity, such as by combining a username and password combination in addition to a fingerprint scan, reduces the risk of unauthorized access. The Australian networks, server, and workstations have all been secured using multi-factor authentication. To sign into any Australian-issued workstation or server, a username-password combination must be entered, combined with a USB fob containing a digital certificate issued by the Australian Government Network Certificate Authority must be inserted. This multi-factor authentication ensures that only users with valid credentials, something they know, plus a USB fob, something they have, are permitted to log in. The wired and wireless networks are also configured with 802.1x radius and EAP TLS authentication. This configuration ensures that not only users must enter valid credentials, but the client device from which they are attempting network access must possess and have installed a digital certificate from the Australian Government's Certificate Authority. Otherwise, network access will be denied. The second pillar of information security is authorization. After a user's identity has been proven in the authentication sequence, that user's permission level is determined during the authorization phase. Several popular authentication models exist, and their purpose is to define the access controls that apply to the system's users. The mandatory access control, or MAC, defines various levels of access where each user is linked directly to an access level. The level the user is linked to, plus all lower levels, are accessible to the user. Another popular model of authorization is known as discretionary access control, or DAC, where users are assigned access directly to the resources. The Australian government employs a role-based access control authorization model, also known as RBAC. RBAC contains a hierarchy of access levels similar to MAC. However, in RBAC, users are assigned to roles, and then the roles are mapped to the access levels, instead of user identities being directly mapped to the access levels as found in MAC. Because the Australian government has thousands of employees, the RBAC model deployed in this way is more flexible and thus more appropriate than either DAC or MAC. Access controls are the mechanisms that enforce the authorization model and prevent users from obtaining access to a resource to which they are unauthorized. Access controls in use at the summit include user login policies, NTFS permissions, Windows File Share Access Control List, Layer 3 rules on the hardware firewall and on the server operating system firewall, and the physically locked enclosures that protect the network equipment and server. A vulnerability assessment was conducted by the cybersecurity team to proactively determine potential attack vectors that could be exploited to compromise the Australian network at the summit. The severity of each vulnerability is ranked as high, medium, or low based on the likelihood of exploitation combined with the impact should a compromise occur. The attack vectors listed here coincide with those identified in the Attack Vector and Attribution Analysis Report. High-risk vulnerabilities should be considered top priority and require mitigative action. Vulnerabilities with high classification include unauthorized external media, including supply chain compromise, malicious email attachments, exploitable, unpatched software, and social engineering designed to trick a person into revealing sensitive information. The primary reason these vulnerabilities are classified as high is because exploitation could lead to the installation of an advanced persistent threat, which could be used to log keystrokes and exfiltrate sensitive information for an indefinite period of time. Threats that target these high-risk vulnerabilities should be mitigated with either existing or newly implemented security controls. Medium-risk vulnerabilities should receive the next highest priority after high-risk vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities of the medium classification include misuse of privileged access, loss or theft of equipment, denial of service attacks against the local Wi-Fi network and Windows Server, and man-in-the-middle attacks. If exploited, these vulnerabilities could compromise the availability of the network and server or result in unauthorized access to sensitive information. Low-risk vulnerabilities are classified as such because of the low likelihood of occurrence. Since the Australian server is not exposed directly to the internet and is protected from external networks by both hardware and Windows firewalls, the risk for these vulnerabilities may be accepted as long as the proper configurations of the firewalls have been verified. The following mitigation strategies are intended to address the vulnerabilities from the previous slide. High-priority risk mitigation recommendations are designed to reduce the risk of introduction of malicious software to the server and workstations. The server, end-user workstations, mobile devices, and network equipment should all be sourced from trusted, approved suppliers. Doing so will reduce the risk of having a malicious embedded hardware module pre-installed at the manufacturing source that could compromise the confidentiality of the organization's data. The server in each workstation should run Intrusion Prevention System software, IPS, that is configured to disallow the connection of external media. This will detect and prevent unauthorized USB and other removable media from being connected and delivering a malicious payload to the host. To prevent malicious email attachments from infecting a host, the host-based IPS should be configured to disallow the execution of unapproved, non-whitelisted executables. Group policy, or Remote Management and Monitoring Tools, RMM, should be used to enforce host policies that restrict the use of Excel macros. Client devices should be configured to route their DNS lookups through a DNS filtering service that is intended to prevent the domain name resolution of known malicious websites. Server, workstation, and network equipment operating systems should be up to date according to the vendor's recommended software release. This will reduce the risk of operating system vulnerability exploitation that could be used to compromise the system and gain unauthorized access. Software applications, particularly those used on the server to provide functionality to client devices, should be updated to similarly reduce the risk of exploitation. Finally, end users should be required to undergo security training to safeguard against phishing and other social engineering tactics. This will reduce the risk of a data breach that would occur if an end user or employee is tricked or convinced into divulging sensitive information. Next, we'll discuss medium priority risk mitigation recommendations, which are intended to reduce the risk of misuse, theft, or exfiltration of sensitive data. The role-based access control system should be audited prior to the summit. This should include the verification of individual role membership, confirmation of proper role-to-access level privilege mapping, and a review of resources to ensure that they are mapped to the correct access level. Individuals should never be assigned more privilege than necessary, in accordance with the principle of least privilege. Taking these steps will minimize the impact in the event of internal data theft or end-user account compromise. Full drive encryption should be implemented on all servers, workstations, and mobile devices to prevent unauthorized data access in the event of physical device theft. Network-based IPS should be employed at the hardware firewall to identify and report on suspicious network activity. Host-based IPS, such as Snort, should be deployed on the server to detect, prevent, and alert on brute force login attempts and denial of service attacks. Mobile device management, MDM, and remote management and monitoring systems, RMM, should be used to issue trusted digital certificates to all devices that connect to the Australian Summit network. All organizational servers should be configured to reject any connecting client devices that do not possess a valid digital certificate. This will provide protection against man-in-the-middle attacks such as the Evil Twin or Stingray attacks, which target Wi-Fi and cellular networks respectively. Firewall configurations should be checked on both the hardware firewall and on the Windows Server firewall. The hardware firewall should deny all unsolicited inbound connections, filter suspicious web content, employ deep packet inspection, and have all other available intrusion detection and prevention modules enabled. The Windows Server firewall should block all inbound ports except those that are required for client-server functionality, such as TCP ports 80 and 443 for web server access. This cybersecurity risk assessment presentation was compiled by the cybersecurity team, responsible for safeguarding the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information stored, transmitted, and accessed by Australian government employees and representatives at the 2019 summit. The risk mitigation strategy recommendations that have been provided are considered to be mandatory, and leadership should work towards implementing these recommendations prior to the summit event.